The arrow had punched through his shoulder with enough force to spin Yannick Lawrence backward off his feet, and now he could feel the warm wetness spreading across his chest as he stumbled through the forest undergrowth. He pressed his hand against the wound, feeling the shaft still protruding from the front of his shoulder, the fletching somewhere behind him brushing against his back with every lurching step. The bandits had caught him on the road 3 miles back, 5 of them against one merchant's guard, who had foolishly thought himself capable of protecting a wagon alone. They had killed the merchant quickly, efficiently, but Yannick had managed to wound 2 of them before taking the arrow and fleeing into the dense woods that bordered the frontier territories. Blood soaked through his shirt now, darkening the already brown fabric to near black. His vision swam as he pushed through a curtain of hanging moss, his boots catching on roots that seemed determined to trip him. Behind him, he could hear the bandits crashing through the brush, their voices carrying threats and promises of what they would do when they caught him. They wanted him dead now, not for the pitiful coins in his purse, but because he had put a sword through one of their friends and left him screaming on the forest floor. The trees began to thin ahead, and Yannick felt a desperate surge of hope even as his legs threatened to give out beneath him. If he could just find somewhere to hide, to bind the wound, perhaps he could survive until nightfall and slip away in the darkness. The hope died as quickly as it had sparked when he broke through the tree line and found himself at the edge of a clearing. A small cabin stood in the center, smoke rising from its chimney, and surrounding it were neat rows of vegetables and herbs. Someone lived here, out in the wilderness beyond the safe borders of human settlements. He had no time to consider the wisdom of seeking help from an unknown occupant. His knees buckled and he fell forward, catching himself on one hand while the other still clutched uselessly at his shoulder. The impact sent lightning bolts of agony through his body, and he heard himself cry out, a raw sound that carried across the clearing. The cabin door opened. Yannick's vision was beginning to tunnel, but even through the haze of pain and blood loss, he could see clearly what emerged from that doorway. The woman was tall, nearly 6 feet, with skin the color of spring leaves. She wore a simple dress of undyed linen that reached her knees, and her black hair was bound in a thick braid that fell over one broad shoulder. Tusks, small but unmistakable, curved up from her lower jaw, and her ears came to delicate points. An orc. He had stumbled into the territory of an orc. Every story he had ever heard, every warning from his childhood, came flooding back. Orcs were monsters, savages who ate human flesh and wore the bones of their enemies as ornaments. They were the enemy, the creatures that raided human settlements and left nothing but ash and blood in their wake. He tried to push himself backward, to flee back into the forest even with the bandits behind him, but his body would not obey. His arm gave out and he collapsed onto his side in the dirt, the arrow shaft grinding against something inside him that made the world go white with pain. He heard running footsteps, felt hands on him, strong hands that rolled him onto his back. The orc woman's face appeared above him, her features sharp and angular, her eyes a startling amber color that seemed to catch the afternoon light. She was saying something, words in a language he did not understand, and then she switched to common, her accent thick but the words clear enough. "Do not move. Arrow is deep. You will die if you pull." Yannick tried to speak, to warn her about the bandits, but all that came out was a wet cough that tasted of copper. The woman looked up sharply, her pointed ears swiveling toward the forest, and he realized she had heard what he had not yet seen. The bandits were emerging from the tree line, 5 men with weapons drawn and murder in their eyes. "Well, well," their leader called out, a scarred man with a voice like gravel. "Looks like our rabbit found himself an orc whore to die beside." Do us a favor, Greenskin, and step away from our property. This does not concern your kind." The orc woman stood slowly, positioning herself between Yannick and the advancing men. She said nothing, but her hand moved to her side where a long knife hung from her belt. It was a working blade, meant for skinning game and cutting vegetables, but the way she held it suggested she knew other uses as well. "I said step aside," the leader repeated, his voice hardening, "or we will put you down like the animal you are." "This man is wounded," the orc woman said, her words measured and careful. "He needs healing. You will leave my land." The bandits laughed, spreading out to surround her. Yannick tried again to move, to stand, to do anything, but his body was a distant thing now, growing colder by the moment. He watched as the leader lunged forward, his sword sweeping toward the orc woman's midsection. She moved with a speed that shocked him, sidestepping the blade and bringing her knife up in a brutal arc that opened the man's arm from wrist to elbow. His sword fell from nerveless fingers as he stumbled back with a scream. Two more came at her from either side. She ducked under one swing and caught the other man's wrist, twisting it with enough force that Yannick heard bones crack, even from where he lay. Her knife flashed twice, and both men were down, clutching at wounds that bled freely into the dirt. The remaining two bandits looked at their fallen companions, then at each other, and made the wise decision to flee back into the forest. The orc woman stood for a moment, breathing hard, her knife still raised. Then she seemed to remember Yannick and turned back to him, dropping to her knees beside his prone form. She touched his face, and her hand was surprisingly gentle despite the blood that now stained it. "Stay with me," she said, and began to drag him toward the cabin. The world became a blur of pain and disconnected images. The ceiling of the cabin, rough wooden beams with dried herbs hanging from hooks. The orc woman's face, tight with concentration as she examined the arrow. A sharp, terrible pressure that made him scream. Darkness. When Yannick woke, the light coming through the cabin's single window was different, softer. Evening, perhaps, or early morning. His shoulder throbbed with a deep, constant ache, but the sharp agony was gone. He turned his head slowly and saw that he was lying on a narrow bed against one wall, covered with a thick wool blanket. His shirt was gone, and his shoulder was wrapped in fabric that he did not immediately recognize. It took his still foggy mind a moment to understand what he was seeing. The orc woman sat in a chair near the fireplace, and she was mending something in her lap. Her dress, he realized, was several inches shorter than it had been before. She had torn strips from her own clothing to bandage his wound, and now she was carefully sewing the ragged hem back into something resembling neatness. The blood-stained strips that had once been part of her dress were wrapped tightly around his shoulder, and when he tried to move his arm experimentally, he found that whatever she had done had stopped the bleeding. "You are awake," she said without looking up from her sewing. "Good. I was beginning to think you would sleep for days." Yannick's throat was dry, and when he tried to speak, only a croak emerged. The orc woman set aside her mending and brought him a cup of water, helping him sit up enough to drink. The water was cool and clean with a faint taste of mint, and he drank gratefully until the cup was empty. "The arrow," he managed to ask, "out. It was deep but clean, no poison. You were lucky." She took the cup back and returned it to a table. "I burned the wound to stop the bleeding." "It will scar. You saved my life." She shrugged, a very human gesture that looked strange on her alien features. "You were dying on my land. I could not leave you." "Why not?" The question came out before he could stop it, and he immediately regretted the rudeness. But the orc woman did not seem offended. She returned to her chair and picked up her mending again, her nimble fingers working the needle through the fabric with practiced ease. "Would you have left me to die?" she asked. Yannick wanted to say yes, wanted to claim that he would have had nothing to do with an orc under any circumstances. But he found he could not speak the lie, not to this woman who had defended him from the bandits and torn her own clothing to bind his wounds. "I do not know," he said finally. "I want to think I would have helped, but I have been taught my whole life that your kind are monsters, and I have been taught that yours are cruel and treacherous." She tied off a stitch and bit the thread with her tusks. "Yet here you are in my home, and here I am sewing while you rest. Perhaps we are both fools." Despite everything, despite the pain and the fear and the strangeness of his situation, Yannick felt a smile tug at his lips. Perhaps. They sat in silence for a while, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the soft whisper of needle through fabric. Eventually, Yannick found the courage to ask the question that had been building in his mind. "What is your name?" The orc woman looked up, her amber eyes meeting his, and for a moment he thought she would not answer. Then she set her mending aside and stood, moving to the fireplace to stir the pot that hung over the flames. "Grushka," she said. "My name is Grushka. I am Yannick, Yannick Lawrence. I know. You said your name many times while you were fevered." She ladled something from the pot into a wooden bowl and brought it to him. "Eat. You need strength." The soup was thick with vegetables and bits of meat that might have been rabbit. It was simple fare, but after days on the road eating nothing but dried jerky and hard bread, it tasted like the finest meal Yannick had ever eaten. Grushka watched him eat with what might have been satisfaction, then turned her attention back to the fire. "The bandits," Yannick said between spoonfuls. "Will they come back?" "I do not think so. I hurt them badly, and they saw that I would kill to defend my home. Men like that are cowards. They will find easier prey." She paused, then added, "But if they do come back, I will be ready." "You fought well. Where did you learn that?" Grushka's expression darkened, and Yannick immediately regretted the question. But after a moment she spoke, her voice flat and distant. "I was a warrior once. In my clan all women learned to fight. I was good at it. Very good." She touched the knife at her belt absently. "But that was another life. What happened? I left, or I was cast out. The meaning is the same either way." She met his eyes, and there was a challenge in her gaze as if daring him to judge her. "I showed mercy to a human child during a raid. A little girl, maybe 5 summers old. My clan chief said I was weak, that I had betrayed our people. So I took my things and I left, and I came here to the borderlands where neither human nor orc would bother me." Yannick set down the empty bowl, his mind reeling. Everything he had been taught about orcs said they were incapable of mercy, that they killed without remorse or hesitation. Yet this woman, this orc named Grushka, had been cast out from her own people for the crime of sparing a child's life. And now she had saved him, a human stranger at great risk to herself. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for the child, and for me." Grushka looked away, and in the firelight he could see color darkening her green skin. "You should rest more. The wound needs time to close properly." Over the following days, Yannick found himself settling into an unexpected routine in Grushka's cabin. His shoulder healed slowly, the burned flesh scabbing over and the deep ache gradually fading to a dull throb. Grushka changed his bandages twice daily, her touch gentle despite her obvious strength, and she made poultices from herbs that grew in her garden to prevent infection. She rarely spoke while she worked, but Yannick found the silence comfortable rather than awkward. When he was strong enough to sit up without dizziness, Grushka brought him simple tasks to occupy his hands. She taught him how to prepare the herbs for drying, stripping leaves from stems, and hanging them in careful bundles from the ceiling beams. She showed him how to repair the wicker baskets she used for gathering, weaving new strips of willow through the damaged sections. The work was mindless but satisfying, and it kept him from dwelling on the fact that he was, for the first time in his life, sharing living space with someone he had been raised to fear. On the fourth day, Yannick was finally able to stand and walk without assistance. His shoulder still pulled when he moved his arm too much, but the worst of the injury was behind him. Grushka declared him well enough to help with the chores, and so he found himself following her out into the garden, a basket in his good hand. The garden was larger than it had appeared from the cabin's door, carefully laid out in rows that ran from the edge of the clearing to the tree line. Grushka had planted everything with clear purpose: vegetables near the cabin for easy access, then herbs, and finally medicinal plants at the far edge where the soil was rockier. She moved through the rows with practiced efficiency, pulling weeds and checking the progress of her crops. "This must take a lot of work," Yannick said, kneeling carefully beside a row of carrots. "To maintain all of this alone." "It does, but I have time and it keeps me fed through the winter." Grushka straightened, wiping sweat from her brow with the back of her hand. "In my clan, everyone worked together. The gardens were huge and we all had our tasks. This is much smaller, but it is mine. Do you miss it? Your clan?" She was quiet for a long moment, her hands stilling in the dirt. "Sometimes I miss my mother and my sisters. I miss the feeling of being part of something larger than myself. But I do not miss the raiding, or the killing, or the way the chief would beat anyone who questioned his decisions. I do not miss being told that mercy is weakness." She pulled a weed with more force than necessary and tossed it aside. "Here, I can be who I choose to be." Yannick found himself studying her as she worked. In the bright daylight, with her attention focused on the plants rather than on him, he could see details he had missed before. The way her braid was woven with small beads of carved wood. The careful mending on her dress where she had repaired the strips she had torn for his bandages. The calluses on her hands that spoke of hard work and self-sufficiency. She was, he realized with some surprise, beautiful in her own way. Not by human standards, perhaps, but there was a strength and grace to her movements that he could not help but admire. "What are you looking at?" Grushka asked without turning her head, and Yannick felt heat rush to his face. "Nothing. Sorry." She glanced at him, one eyebrow raised, but said nothing. They continued to work in silence until the basket was full of vegetables for the evening meal. That night, as they sat by the fire eating roasted root vegetables and fresh bread that Grushka had baked in the coals, Yannick found himself telling her about his life. He spoke of growing up in a small farming village near the eastern border, of learning the sword from his father, who had been a soldier, before an injury forced him to retire. He told her about taking work as a caravan guard because it was the only way to see the world beyond his village's narrow boundaries, and about the merchant who had hired him for what should have been a simple 3-day journey. "He was a good man," Yannick said, staring into the flames. "He had a wife and 2 sons waiting for him in the next town. They will wonder why he does not return. The bandits killed him, quickly. He never had a chance to defend himself." Yannick set down his plate, his appetite suddenly gone. "I should have protected him. That was my job." "You were 1 man against 5. You did what you could and you survived. That is enough." "Is it?" Yannick looked up at her and was surprised to see understanding in her amber eyes. "You sound like you speak from experience." "I do. I told you I was a warrior." Grushka poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling up toward the ceiling. "I lost friends in battle. I could not save them all, no matter how skilled I was with a blade. It took me many seasons to understand that their deaths were not my failure. We all fight the battles we can, and sometimes we lose. That is the way of the world." They sat together in the firelight, 2 people from different worlds bound together by circumstance and shared pain. And slowly, carefully, something began to grow between them that neither of them had words for yet. The days stretched into weeks, and summer deepened into its full heat. Yannick's shoulder healed enough that he could use his arm again, though it still ached when the weather changed, and he knew it always would. He had initially planned to leave as soon as he was well enough to travel, to make his way to the nearest town and find new work. But somehow, days kept passing and he kept finding reasons to stay a little longer. At first, the reasons were practical. He helped Grushka repair the cabin's roof where the winter had damaged the shingles. He built a new fence around the garden to keep out the deer that had been stealing her vegetables. He chopped firewood and stacked it in careful cords against the coming winter, even though winter was still months away. Each task led to another, and Grushka never asked him to leave, so he stayed. But as the weeks passed, Yannick had to admit to himself that the reasons were becoming less practical and more personal. He enjoyed Grushka's company, enjoyed the way she spoke her mind without pretense or social niceties. He liked the sound of her laughter, rare but genuine, that came when he told her stories of his more foolish adventures as a young guard. He found himself watching for the small smiles that tugged at her lips when she was pleased with something, the way her ears twitched when she was thinking deeply about a problem. He realized with a mixture of wonder and terror, falling in love with an orc. The realization came to him one morning as he worked in the garden, pulling weeds from between the rows of beans. Grushka was nearby, harvesting herbs for drying, and she was humming softly to herself as she worked. It was a melody he did not recognize, probably something from her clan, and her voice was surprisingly lovely. He found himself stopping his work just to listen, and when she noticed and looked at him questioningly, he felt his heart skip in a way that had nothing to do with exertion. "Sorry," he said quickly, turning back to the weeds. "Your song, it is pretty. It is a working song. We sang it during harvest time." She paused, then added softly, "I have not sung it in many seasons. I had almost forgotten the words. I am glad you remembered." They finished their work in comfortable silence, and when they returned to the cabin for the midday meal, Yannick found himself sitting closer to her than strictly necessary. If Grushka noticed, she gave no sign, but when their hands accidentally brushed as they both reached for the bread, she did not pull away. That night, unable to sleep, Yannick lay on his narrow bed and stared at the ceiling beams. Grushka slept on the other side of the cabin in her own bed, separated from him by a curtain of hanging fabric that gave them both a measure of privacy. He could hear her breathing, slow and steady, and he wondered what she dreamed about. Did she dream of her old life, her clan and family? Did she dream of a future here in her cabin, alone at the edge of the wilderness? Did she ever, even for a moment, dream of him? The thought was dangerous, he knew. Even if Grushka felt something for him, even if by some miracle she returned his feelings, what future could they have together? Humans and orcs did not marry, did not build lives together. They were enemies by nature and custom, and the few stories he had heard of such unions all ended in tragedy. He would be cast out from human society if he tried to bring her to a town, and she had already been cast out from her own people for showing mercy once. They would be alone, truly alone, with no place in either world. But as he lay there in the darkness, listening to Grushka breathe, Yannick found that the thought of being alone with her did not frighten him as much as it should have. Perhaps, he thought, they could build their own place in the world, here on the border between human and orc lands. Perhaps it was enough to simply be together, regardless of what either of their peoples might think. He was still wrestling with these thoughts when sleep finally claimed him, and his dreams were full of amber eyes and the sound of humming. The change in their relationship was gradual, subtle enough that Yannick could not point to a single moment when everything shifted. But shift it did, slowly and inexorably, like the turning of seasons. They began to work closer together, finding excuses to touch in small, casual ways. Grushka's hand on his arm when she wanted to show him something in the garden. His steadying grip on her waist when she climbed a ladder to repair the roof. Each touch was innocent, justified, but they lingered a fraction longer than necessary. Their conversations grew deeper, more personal. Grushka told him about her childhood in the clan, about learning to fight from her mother who had been a legendary warrior. She spoke of the raids she had participated in, her voice tight with shame and regret, and Yannick listened without judgment. In turn, he told her about his own regrets, the people he had failed to protect, the choices he wished he could unmake. They shared their pains and their hopes, slowly stripping away the walls they had both built around their hearts. One evening, as they sat by the fire after the day's work was done, Grushka asked him the question he had been dreading. "When will you leave?" Yannick looked up from the piece of wood he had been carving, a small figure that was slowly taking the shape of a rabbit. "Do you want me to leave?" "I asked you first." He set down the carving and the knife, giving her his full attention. She was staring into the fire, her profile sharp against the dancing light, and he could not read her expression. "I do not want to leave," he said carefully, "but I have been here for weeks now. I am healed. You have your life here, your routine. I do not want to be a burden." "You are not a burden." The words came out quickly, almost harshly, and Grushka's hands clenched in her lap. "You have helped me more than you know. The cabin is stronger now. The garden is healthier. The firewood is cut. These things would have taken me months to do alone. Then I can stay. A while longer." Grushka finally turned to look at him, and there was something in her eyes that made his breath catch. "Stay as long as you want, Yannick Lawrence. Stay forever if you wish it. I would not mind the company." The words hung between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Yannick wanted to cross the small space that separated them, to take her hand and tell her exactly how much he wanted to stay, but fear held him back. Fear of rejection, fear of ruining what they had built, fear of a future that seemed impossible no matter how much he might want it. "I would like that," he said instead, his voice barely above a whisper. "To stay." Grushka nodded once, then turned back to the fire. But Yannick saw the small smile that curved her lips, and he knew that something between them had changed irrevocably. The summer waned and autumn arrived with cool winds and leaves that turned gold and red. Yannick and Grushka worked together to preserve food for the coming winter, pickling vegetables and smoking meat, and gathering the last of the herbs before the first frost. They fell into a partnership that felt as natural as breathing, each of them anticipating the other's needs without speaking. When Grushka reached for a jar, Yannick had it ready. When he needed twine to tie the herb bundles, she placed it in his hand before he could ask. They talked less now, but the silence between them was warm and comfortable. They had learned each other's rhythms, each other's moods, and words were often unnecessary. But sometimes, in the evening when the work was done, they would sit close together by the fire and Grushka would tell him stories of her people. She spoke of great warriors and clever tricksters, of spirits that lived in the forest and mountains that walked like men. Yannick listened, enchanted not just by the stories, but by the way she told them, her voice rising and falling with the drama of each tale. One night, emboldened by the intimacy of the moment, Yannick reached out and took her hand. Grushka went very still, her eyes widening in surprise, but she did not pull away. Her hand was larger than his, the skin tough and calloused, but it was also warm and very much alive in his grasp. "Grushka," he said softly, "I need to tell you something. Do not." Her voice was strained, almost pleading. "Do not say it, Yannick. Once you say it, we cannot go back." Maybe I do not want to go back. He squeezed her hand gently. I care about you more than I should, maybe. More than is wise, but I cannot keep pretending that I do not feel this way. Grushka closed her eyes, and when she spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. You are human, I am orc, this cannot be. Why not? We are here together, we make each other happy. Why does it matter what we are? It matters because the world says it matters. She opened her eyes and looked at him, and he saw fear there, raw and painful. Your people would cast you out if they knew. They would call you traitor, orc lover, worse. You would lose everything. I have nothing to lose. No family, no home, no ties to any place or people. All I have is this cabin, this life we have built together. That is enough for me. He brought her hand up to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently. The question is it enough for you? For a long moment, Grushka said nothing. Then slowly, tentatively, she reached out with her free hand and touched his face. Her fingers traced the line of his jaw, the curve of his cheekbone, as if she were memorizing him by touch. I was alone for so long, she whispered. I thought I would always be alone, that this was my punishment for defying my clan. But then you came, bleeding and dying on my doorstep, and everything changed. You made me remember what it was like to have someone to talk to work beside, to share meals and stories with. You made me remember how to be happy. Then let me stay, not as a guest, not as someone passing through. Let me stay as your partner, your companion. Let me love you the way you deserve to be loved. Tears were sliding down Grushka's cheeks now, catching the firelight like little stars. I am afraid, she admitted. I am afraid that I will lose you, that the world will take you from me the way it has taken everything else. I am afraid too, but I think that is part of love, is it not? Being afraid but choosing it anyway because the alternative is worse. Yannick leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull back if she wanted to. I choose you, Grushka. I choose this life, this future, whatever it might hold. I choose you. She closed the distance between them, her lips meeting his in a kiss that was both desperate and tender. It was strange, kissing someone with tusks, but Yannick found he did not care. All that mattered was the warmth of her mouth, the way her hand cupped the back of his head, the soft sound she made deep in her throat. They kissed for a long time, years of loneliness and longing pouring out between them, until finally they broke apart, both breathing hard. I choose you too, Grushka said, her forehead resting against his. Gods help me, but I choose you. They sat together by the fire until the flames burned low, wrapped in each other's arms, and for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, they felt truly at peace. The weeks that followed were the happiest Yannick had ever known. He and Grushka made no grand declarations, held no ceremonies to mark their union. They simply continued their life together with a new understanding, a new intimacy that colored everything they did. They shared the same bed now, holding each other through the cold autumn nights, and woke tangled together in the mornings. They worked side by side during the day, and in the evening they sat close by the fire, talking or simply enjoying each other's presence. The physical side of their relationship developed slowly, carefully. Both of them were aware of their differences, aware that their bodies did not fit together the way two humans or two orcs might. But they learned each other with patience and tenderness, discovering what brought pleasure and what did not. Grushka was stronger than any human woman, and she had to be mindful of her strength. But Yannick found her gentleness all the more precious for the power she held in check. For her part, Grushka marveled at the smoothness of his skin, the relative fragility of his frame, and treated him with a care that made his heart ache. They were not without their difficulties. Sometimes Grushka would wake from nightmares, reliving the raids she had participated in, and Yannick would hold her while she shook with grief and shame. Sometimes Yannick would grow quiet and withdrawn, thinking of the life he had left behind, the people who would never know what had become of him. But they faced these moments together, supporting each other through the darkness until the light returned. As autumn deepened and the first frost painted the world white, they began to prepare in earnest for winter. Yannick had never spent a winter in the wilderness before, and he relied heavily on Grushka's knowledge and experience. They insulated the cabin with mud and moss, packed snow against the foundation to keep out drafts, and moved their stores of food into the cold cellar Grushka had dug beneath the floor. They gathered deadwood from the forest, hauling back massive logs that would burn long and hot through the coldest nights. It was during one of these wood-gathering expeditions that they encountered other orcs for the first time. They were deep in the forest, farther from the cabin than they usually ventured, when Yannick heard voices. He froze, one hand automatically going to the hatchet at his belt, and looked to Grushka. Her face had gone pale beneath her green skin, and her ears were flat against her head in what he had learned was a sign of fear or aggression. "My clan," she whispered. "A hunting party, I think. Can we avoid them? Maybe, if we are quiet." They began to move slowly back the way they had come, carefully placing each step to avoid snapping twigs or rustling leaves. But fortune was not with them. A shout rang out from behind them, followed by the sound of running feet. Yannick turned to see 3 orc warriors emerging from the trees, all male, all heavily armed. They wore the leathers and furs typical of orc raiders, and their faces were painted with black and red markings. The lead warrior, a massive orc with a scar running down one side of his face, stopped short when he saw Grushka. His eyes widened in recognition, then narrowed with contempt. "Grushka the Merciful," he said, his voice dripping with scorn. "I did not think we would see you again. Yet here you are, living like a coward in the woods." "I live as I choose, Ractor," Grushka replied, her voice steady despite the tension in her frame. "I have no quarrel with you or the clan. Let us pass." Ractor's gaze shifted to Yannick, and his expression twisted into something ugly. "And you have taken a human as a mate. Is this what you have become? A traitor who lies with the enemy? He is not my enemy, and what I do with my life is no concern of yours. It is the concern of the clan when one of our own betrays us." Ractor drew his sword, a brutal-looking blade with a serrated edge. "The chief was merciful when he cast you out. He should have killed you for your weakness. Perhaps I will finish what he started." Yannick stepped forward, putting himself between Grushka and the orc warriors. "You will have to go through me first." Ractor laughed, a harsh sound that echoed through the trees. "A human thinks he can stand against an orc warrior. You are either very brave or very stupid. Maybe both. But I will not let you hurt her." The tension stretched taut, everyone poised for violence. Then, to Yannick's surprise, one of the other warriors spoke up. "Ractor, this is foolish. We are here to hunt, not to settle old grudges. If we bring back a human's body, the chief will demand to know why we killed him. It will bring trouble down on the clan." "Duroc speaks sense," the third warrior added. "Let them go. They are exiles beneath our notice." Ractor's jaw clenched, and for a moment Yannick thought he would attack anyway. But then the orc warrior sheathed his sword with an angry motion and spat on the ground at their feet. "You are not worth the effort. But know this, traitor. If you ever set foot in clan territory again, I will not be so merciful. And if your human comes anywhere near our lands, we will gut him and leave him for the crows." The 3 orcs turned and disappeared back into the forest, leaving Yannick and Grushka alone in the sudden silence. Yannick's heart was pounding, his hand still gripping the hatchet, and he realized he was shaking. "Are you all right?" Grushka asked, her hand on his arm. "I should be asking you that. Those were your people. They were, once." She took a deep breath and let it out slowly. Come. We should return to the cabin. It is not safe here. They gathered what wood they could carry and made their way back through the forest, moving quickly and quietly. Neither of them spoke until they were safely inside the cabin with the door barred behind them. Only then did Grushka allow herself to sink down onto the bed, her head in her hands. "I knew this might happen someday," she said softly. "I knew they might find me, but I hoped we would have more time." Yannick sat beside her and pulled her against his chest, holding her tightly. "We will be all right. They are not going to attack us here, not if it would bring trouble to their clan. You do not know Ractor. He was always ambitious, always looking for ways to prove his strength. If he thinks he can kill you without consequence, he will." She looked up at him, her eyes haunted. "Maybe you should leave, Yannick. Go to a human town where you will be safe. I can survive here alone. I did it before I met you." "No." The word came out more forcefully than he intended, but he did not soften it. "I am not leaving you. We face this together, the same way we face everything else. But if something happens to you because of me, then it happens. But I am not abandoning you because of a threat from someone too cowardly to even fight when he had the chance." He kissed her forehead gently. "We are in this together, remember. You and me against the world if that is what it takes." Grushka closed her eyes and leaned into him, and Yannick felt the tension slowly drain from her body. They sat together in the dim light of the cabin, drawing comfort from each other's presence, and eventually the fear faded into determination. They would face whatever came together, and they would survive. Winter arrived in earnest a week later, burying the world under a blanket of snow. The forest fell silent except for the whisper of wind through bare branches and the occasional cry of a hunting owl. Yannick and Grushka settled into the rhythms of winter life, their world shrinking to the warmth of the cabin and the immediate surroundings. They rarely went far from home, venturing out only to check the snares Grushka had set for rabbits and to gather what little firewood they could find under the snow. The close quarters could have bred tension, but instead Yannick found that the enforced intimacy only deepened their bond. They cooked together, worked on small projects together, told each other stories and played simple games to pass the long dark hours. Grushka taught him to speak some words in the orcish tongue, laughing at his clumsy pronunciation. He taught her songs from his childhood, and she learned the words and sang them back to him in her rich voice. On the longest night of winter, they made love by the firelight and afterward lay tangled together under the blankets, warm and content. Yannick traced idle patterns on Grushka's arm, following the faint scars that marked her green skin. "I have been thinking," he said quietly, "about the future." "What about it?" "I want to marry you, properly I mean, with vows and commitment." Grushka shifted to look at him, her expression unreadable. "Humans and orcs do not marry. Then we will be the first. I do not care about tradition or custom. I want the world to know that we belong to each other, that this is permanent. The world does not care what we want, Yannick. And there is no priest or shaman who would perform such a ceremony. Then we will make our own vows here in this cabin, just you and me and the gods as our witnesses." He took her hand and pressed it to his chest, over his heart. "I love you, Grushka. I want to spend the rest of my life with you. I want to build something real and lasting, something that cannot be broken by distance or prejudice or fear. Will you marry me?" Tears welled in Grushka's eyes, spilling over to run down her cheeks. "You are certain? You truly want this?" "I have never been more certain of anything." She was quiet for a long moment, and Yannick's heart hammered in his chest as he waited for her answer. Then, finally, she nodded. "Yes. Yes, I will marry you, Yannick Lawrence. I will stand with you before the gods and swear to be yours now and always." They sealed the promise with a kiss, and when they finally drew apart, both of them were smiling through their tears. They spent the rest of the night talking about what their ceremony would look like, what vows they would make to each other. It would be simple, they decided, with no witnesses except the forest and the sky. They would exchange gifts and speak words of binding, and that would be enough. When the dawn came, pale and cold, they rose and dressed in their best clothing. Grushka wore the dress she had mended, the one she had torn to bandage Yannick's wound all those months ago. Yannick wore his guard's uniform, cleaned and patched where the arrow had gone through. They held hands and walked out into the snowy clearing, their breath steaming in the frozen air. They stood facing each other, the cabin at their backs and the endless forest stretching out before them. The world was silent except for the soft sound of falling snow, and the moment felt sacred in a way that transcended any church or temple. Yannick spoke first, his voice steady despite the emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. I, Yannick Lawrence, take you, Grushka, as my wife and my partner. I vow to stand beside you through all the days of my life, to share your joys and your sorrows, to protect you when you need protection, and to let you be strong when strength is needed. I vow to love you without reservation, without hesitation, for as long as I draw breath. You are my home, my heart, my future. This I swear before the gods and the world. Grushka's hands trembled in his, but her voice was strong. I, Grushka, take you, Yannick Lawrence, as my husband and my partner. I vow to walk beside you through all the seasons of our lives, to celebrate your victories and mourn your losses, to be your shelter in the storm and your companion in the quiet times. I vow to love you fiercely and completely, for as long as the earth turns beneath our feet. You are my chosen, my beloved, my everything. This I swear before the gods and the world. They had no rings to exchange, but Yannick had carved 2 bands from oak wood, polished smooth and inscribed with their names. He slipped one onto Grushka's finger and she did the same for him, the simple bands warm against their cold skin. By these vows and these tokens, we are bound, Yannick said. Husband and wife from this day forward. Husband and wife, Grushka echoed, now and always. They kissed there in the snow, sealing their union with the taste of cold air and warm breath. And though no official authority had blessed their marriage, though no community stood witness to their vows, Yannick knew in his heart that it was real and binding. They belonged to each other now, completely and irrevocably. The rest of the winter passed in a warm haze of contentment. They were newlyweds in every sense of the word, giddy with the newness of their official bond. Grushka wore her wooden ring constantly, touching it often as if to reassure herself it was real. Yannick found himself studying his own ring in the firelight, marveling at the simple symbol of everything they had promised each other. But their happiness was not destined to last undisturbed. Spring came early that year, melting the snow in great rushing torrents and waking the forest from its winter sleep. Yannick and Grushka emerged from their cabin to find the world transformed, green shoots pushing up through the mud and birds returning to fill the air with song. They set to work immediately, preparing the garden for planting and making repairs to the winter damage. It was during this work, on a morning bright with promise, that the riders came. Yannick saw them first, 3 figures on horseback emerging from the forest on the road that led to the nearest human settlement. He called out to Grushka, who straightened from her work in the garden, one hand shading her eyes against the sun. Humans, she said quietly. A patrol, maybe. Or hunters. Should we go inside? No, if we hide they will be suspicious. Better to meet them openly. She brushed the dirt from her hands and moved to stand beside Yannick, close enough that their shoulders touched. He drew comfort from her presence as the riders approached. The leader was a man in his 40s, wearing the uniform of a frontier militia captain. His face was weathered and stern, and his hand rested casually on the sword at his hip. The two men flanking him were younger, probably common soldiers, and they stared at Grushka with a mixture of fear and fascination. "Good morning," the captain said, his voice carefully neutral. "I am Captain Yorick Larson of the Frontier Militia. We are making a patrol of the borderlands, ensuring that settlements remain safe from threats." His eyes moved between Yannick and Grushka, lingering on their joined hands. "Are you the owner of this property?" "We both are," Yannick said before Grushka could speak. "This is our home." "I see." Captain Larson's expression remained unreadable. "And you are aware that you are harboring an orc, in violation of the settlement treaties." "I am not harboring her. She is my wife." The words fell like stones into a still pond. One of the soldiers made a strangled sound, quickly stifled. The captain's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Your wife," he repeated, his tone flat. "You have married an orc." "I have, and we are causing no trouble, threatening no one. We simply want to live our lives in peace. The law is clear on this matter. Orcs are not permitted to settle on human lands, and humans who consort with orcs are subject to exile and loss of citizenship." Captain Larson's hand tightened on his sword hilt. "I could arrest you both right now." "This is not human land," Grushka said, her voice calm but firm. "This is border territory, claimed by neither orc nor human. I have lived here for many seasons, and I have harmed no one. You have no authority here. I have the authority granted to me by the Crown, and that authority extends to the protection of human citizens from orc threats. I am not a threat. I am a woman who wishes to tend her garden and live with her husband. Is that truly so dangerous that you must bring soldiers to my door?" Captain Larson studied them both for a long moment. Then, to Yannick's surprise, his expression softened slightly. "You served in the guard," he said, gesturing to Yannick's uniform jacket hanging on a peg by the cabin door. "I recognize the insignia. I did, for 3 years. Then you know the law and you know the consequences of breaking it." The captain sighed, suddenly looking very tired. "I do not like this any more than you do. But there have been raids recently, orc war parties attacking settlements along the border. People are afraid and they are demanding action. If word gets out that there is an orc living here, even a peaceful one, there will be trouble." "So what are you suggesting?" Yannick asked, his heart sinking. "Leave. Both of you. Go somewhere far from the border, somewhere you can live quietly without drawing attention. I will file my report saying that this cabin was abandoned and I saw no signs of orc activity. That will buy you time." "And if we refuse?" Captain Larson's face hardened again. "Then I will be forced to do my duty. I do not want to arrest you or harm you, but I will if I must. The safety of the settlements is my responsibility." Yannick felt Grushka's hand tighten on his, felt the tension radiating from her body. He knew what she was thinking. They could fight. They could drive the soldiers off. Between his sword skills and her warrior training, they could probably defeat these 3 men. But then there would be more soldiers and more, until eventually they would be overwhelmed or forced to flee anyway. "Give us a week," Yannick said quietly, "to pack our things and decide where to go. 1 week and then we will leave." The captain considered this, then nodded. 1 week. I will return at the end of that time to ensure you have gone. If you are still here, I will have no choice but to take action." He gathered his reins and turned his horse. "I am sorry. For what it is worth, I hope you find peace wherever you go." The 3 riders departed, disappearing back down the road into the forest. Yannick and Grushka stood in silence, watching them go until the sound of hoofbeats faded completely. "Well," Grushka said eventually, her voice carefully controlled. "That is that then, we must leave. I am so sorry, this is my fault. If I had just been more careful, if I had hidden when they approached, stop." She turned to face him, taking both his hands in hers. "This is not your fault. It is the world's fault, the world that will not let us simply exist. But we will survive this, Yannick. We have survived everything else together. We will survive this too." They spent the next days packing what they could carry and deciding what to leave behind. It was a heartbreaking process, choosing which of Grushka's carefully tended possessions to take and which to abandon. In the end, they packed light: clothing, tools, dried food, and little else. Grushka took seeds from her garden, carefully wrapped in cloth, and Yannick took his sword and the small carving of a rabbit he had made that first week together. On the last morning, they stood in the empty cabin and looked around at the space that had been their home. Grushka's eyes were bright with unshed tears, and Yannick put his arm around her waist, holding her close. "We will build another home," he promised. "Somewhere safe, somewhere they cannot find us. Where? Where can we go that we will not face the same problems?" Yannick had been thinking about this for days, turning over their limited options in his mind. "North," he said finally. "Beyond the frontier, into the unmapped territories. There are rumors of valleys and forests there where neither human nor orc holds dominion, where people live by their own laws. It will be dangerous, but we will be free. The north is wild, full of beasts and bad weather and who knows what else. I know, but we are strong and we are together. We can make a life there, I know we can." Grushka leaned her head against his shoulder and closed her eyes. "Then north it is." Together, they shouldered their packs and walked out of the cabin without looking back, locking the door behind them out of habit even though they would never return. The morning was cool and misty, the sun just beginning to burn through the clouds. They took the small game trail that led north, away from the road and the settlements, into the deep wilderness. The journey north was harder than either of them had anticipated. The game trails petered out after a few days, forcing them to cut their own path through dense undergrowth and across swift running streams. They rationed their food carefully, supplementing their supplies with fish caught from streams and edible plants that Grushka identified. Yannick hunted when he could, bringing down rabbits and once a young deer with his bow. They traveled in silence much of the time, conserving their energy for the grueling march. But in the evenings, when they made camp and huddled close together for warmth, they would talk about the future. They planned the home they would build, describing it in loving detail. A larger cabin with 2 rooms, one for living and one for sleeping. A garden even bigger than the one they had left behind. Maybe, eventually, children who would grow up in freedom, knowing nothing of the prejudices that had forced their parents to flee. "You think it is possible?" Grushka asked one night as they lay beneath the stars. "For our children to live differently than we have?" "I do not know," Yannick admitted, "but I hope so. I hope we can build something better for them. Half human, half orc, they would belong to neither world. Then they will belong to our world, the one we create for them." He kissed her temple gently. "We will teach them that love matters more than blood, that family is what you make it. They will be strong because they come from strong parents, and they will be kind because they will know what cruelty costs." Grushka pulled him closer, her arms tight around his waist. "You make it sound so easy." "It will not be easy, but it will be worth it. Every hardship, every challenge, it will all be worth it." They pressed on through the wilderness, heading ever north. The land grew wilder, more rugged as they left the settled regions behind. They saw no signs of human habitation, and only occasionally did they catch glimpses of orc scouts in the distance. They avoided contact with everyone, moving like ghosts through the forest. 3 weeks after leaving the cabin, exhausted and nearly out of supplies, they crested a ridge and looked down into a valley that took their breath away. It was a bowl of green nestled between high peaks, with a river running through the center that sparkled in the sunlight. Trees covered the slopes, and in the valley floor they could see open meadows dotted with wildflowers. It was beautiful, isolated, and perfect. "There," Grushka said softly. "That is where we will build our home." They made their way down into the valley, their spirits lifting with every step. The valley was everything they had hoped for and more. The soil was rich and dark, perfect for farming. The river teemed with fish, and the forest was full of game. There were caves in the mountainsides that could provide shelter until they built something more permanent. They chose a spot near the river, on a slight rise that would keep them above flooding, and began to work. Using Yannick's sword and the small axe they had brought, they felled trees and stripped them of branches. It was back-breaking work, made harder by their fatigue and limited tools, but they labored from dawn to dusk, driven by the vision of their future home. Slowly, day by day, the cabin took shape. It was rough work, not as neat as Grushka's old home had been, but it was sturdy and weatherproof. They built it larger than necessary, planning for the family they hoped to have one day. When the walls were up and the roof thatched with bundles of grass and reeds, they stood back and looked at what they had created together. "It is beautiful," Grushka said, and Yannick heard the tears in her voice. "It is ours, truly ours, built by our hands. No one can take this from us." They moved into the cabin that very night, spreading their bedrolls on the packed earth floor and falling asleep in each other's arms. When morning came, they woke to sunlight streaming through the open doorway and the sound of birdsong from the forest. It felt, Yannick thought, like waking up in paradise. The months that followed were busy with the work of establishing their new home. They cleared land for a garden and planted the seeds Grushka had brought from her old home. They built furniture, a bed frame, a table, chairs, shelves to hold their few possessions. They constructed a smokehouse for preserving meat and dug a root cellar to keep vegetables through the winter. Every day brought new tasks, new challenges, but they faced them all together. As spring turned to summer, the garden flourished beyond their hopes. Vegetables grew in abundance, and Grushka's knowledge of herbs and medicinal plants served them well. They gathered wild berries from the forest and smoked fish from the river. They were, against all odds, thriving. One evening in late summer, as they sat outside the cabin watching the sun set over the mountains, Grushka placed Yannick's hand on her stomach. "I am with child," she said softly. "I am certain now." Yannick's breath caught in his throat. "You are sure, I am sure. We will have a baby by winter's end." He pulled her into his arms, holding her with infinite care as if she might shatter. "A baby," he whispered. "We are going to have a baby. Are you happy?" "Happy." "Grushka, I am terrified and overjoyed and amazed all at once. We are going to be parents." They sat together as the stars came out, talking in hushed, excited voices about the life growing inside Grushka. They discussed names and made plans for a cradle, and wondered whether the child would take after its mother or father. Through it all ran a current of fierce protectiveness, a determination that this child would have the life they had been denied, a life of peace and love, free from prejudice and fear. The pregnancy progressed without complication, though Yannick hovered over Grushka like an anxious nursemaid, constantly fretting about her health. She tolerated his worrying with patient amusement, assuring him that orc women were strong and that childbirth was a natural process. But as her belly grew and the baby began to move, Yannick saw the fear in her eyes that matched his own. They were alone here, with no midwife or healer to help if something went wrong. "We will manage," Grushka said when he voiced his concerns. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time. We will manage." And manage they did. When the first pains came on a cold winter night, Yannick helped Grushka into the bed they had built, and tried to remember everything she had told him about the birthing process. He boiled water and gathered clean cloth and held her hand through the contractions, feeling utterly helpless in the face of her pain. The labor was long and difficult. Grushka was strong, stronger than any human woman could be, but even she was pushed to her limits. Yannick stayed by her side through all of it, wiping the sweat from her face and speaking words of encouragement even when he was not sure she could hear him. Finally, as dawn light began to creep through the window, a baby's cry filled the cabin. Yannick looked down at the tiny, squalling infant in his hands and felt his heart expand to a size he had not known was possible. The baby was perfect, smaller than a full orc infant but larger than a human, with skin that was a pale olive green and the tiniest hint of tusks just visible beneath its upper lip. "A girl," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We have a daughter." Grushka held out her arms, exhausted but smiling, and Yannick carefully placed the baby on her chest. Mother and daughter regarded each other for a long moment, and then the baby began to root for milk, instinct driving her to her mother's breast. "She is beautiful," Grushka whispered. "Look at her, Yannick. Look at what we made. She is perfect, absolutely perfect." He sat on the edge of the bed, one hand on Grushka's shoulder and one gently touching the baby's soft head. "What should we name her?" They had discussed names for months, but now that the moment was here, all those carefully chosen options seemed inadequate. They sat in silence for a while, watching their daughter nurse, until Grushka spoke. "Hope. Let us name her Hope, because she is the hope we have built for the future." "Hope," Yannick repeated, testing the name. "Hope Lawrence, I like it." They spent the rest of that day in quiet contentment, a new family finding their rhythm together. Hope proved to be a healthy, vigorous baby with strong lungs and a healthy appetite. She had her mother's pointed ears and her father's eyes, a perfect blend of both her parents. Yannick could not stop staring at her, marveling at the tiny miracle they had created. As the days passed and Grushka recovered her strength, they settled into the demanding routine of new parenthood. Hope needed constant care, feeding, changing, rocking when she fussed. But neither Yannick nor Grushka begrudged a single moment of lost sleep or interrupted meal. They had waited so long for this, risked so much, that every cry and every smile felt like a gift. The first time Hope laughed, Yannick wept with joy. The first time she reached out and grasped his finger with her tiny hand, he felt a surge of protectiveness so fierce it was almost painful. This was his daughter, his blood and bone, and he would die before he let anyone hurt her. Winter gave way to spring, and Hope grew with astonishing speed. By the time the first flowers bloomed, she was sitting up on her own and babbling in a language that seemed to combine human and orcish sounds. Grushka sang her the old working songs, and Yannick told her stories about brave knights and clever tricksters. She listened with rapt attention, her amber eyes bright and curious. One warm afternoon in late spring, as Yannick worked in the garden with Hope strapped to his back in a carrier he had fashioned, he saw figures emerging from the forest. His hand went immediately to the knife at his belt, but Grushka, working nearby, put a hand on his arm. "Wait," she said. "Let us see what they want." There were 5 of them, 3 orcs and 2 humans traveling together. As they drew closer, Yannick saw that they looked weary and cautious, but not hostile. The group stopped at the edge of the clearing, and one of the humans, a woman with gray streaked hair, called out, "Hello, the house. We come in peace and mean no harm. May we approach?" Yannick and Grushka exchanged a glance, then Yannick nodded. "Approach slowly. Keep your hands visible." The group moved forward until they stood a respectful distance from the garden. Up close, Yannick could see that they were all worn from travel, their clothing patched and their faces marked by hardship. But there was something else in their expressions. Hope. "We heard rumors," the woman said. "Stories of a valley where humans and orcs live together in peace. We did not believe it at first, but we had nowhere else to go." "Are the stories true stories?" Yannick asked, confused. "What stories?" "That there is a couple here, human and orc, who have built a life together. That they welcome others who are cast out for similar bonds." An orc man stepped forward, and Yannick saw that he held hands with one of the human men. "We are exiles, all of us, driven from our homes because we dared to love across the divide. If the valley will have us, we wish to stay. We will work hard and cause no trouble." Yannick felt a wave of emotion crash over him. They were not alone. There were others like them, others who had dared to defy tradition for the sake of love. He looked at Grushka and saw his own thoughts reflected in her face. "The valley is large," Grushka said slowly. "Large enough for many homes. If you are willing to work, willing to build, we would welcome the company." The relief on the travelers' faces was palpable. They seemed to sag where they stood, as if a great weight had been lifted from their shoulders. "Thank you," the woman said, her voice breaking. "Thank you so much. You do not know what this means to us." Over the following days, Yannick and Grushka helped the newcomers choose sites for their cabins and showed them the best places to fish and hunt. They shared their knowledge of the land freely, and in return the newcomers brought their own skills. The woman was a healer, one of the orcs was a skilled craftsman, one of the human men knew how to work metal. Together, they began to build something larger than any of them could have managed alone. More people came in the months that followed, drawn by the rumors of the peaceful valley. Some were mixed couples like Yannick and Grushka. Others were simply outcasts who had found no place in either human or orc society. Half-breeds, those marked by old scars or disabilities, those who had refused to participate in the endless cycle of raids and retaliation. They came seeking refuge, and they found a community. By the time Hope took her first steps, there were 10 cabins in the valley and more being built. The valley had transformed from a wilderness into a settlement, a true community where humans and orcs worked side by side. There were challenges, of course. Misunderstandings born of different customs, old prejudices that occasionally flared into arguments. But they worked through these conflicts together, guided by the example Yannick and Grushka had set. They held meetings in the common area between the cabins, where everyone had a voice in decisions that affected the community. They celebrated both human and orc festivals, learning from each other's traditions. Children were born who, like Hope, belonged to neither culture and both, and they grew up playing together without any awareness of the hatred that had driven their parents to this place. On a summer evening 2 years after Hope's birth, Yannick stood on the porch of their cabin and looked out over the valley. There were lights glowing in the windows of a dozen cabins now, and he could hear the sound of laughter and music drifting on the warm air. Grushka came out to join him, Hope balanced on her hip and another child, their son, growing in her belly. "What are you thinking?" she asked, leaning against his side. "I am thinking that we did it. Against every odd, despite everything that tried to tear us apart, we built something good. Something real. We did. And it all started because you stumbled into my clearing, bleeding and desperate, and I was fool enough to save you." Yannick laughed and pulled her close, careful not to squish Hope between them. "Best decision you ever made, the very best." She kissed him, a sweet press of lips that still sent warmth flooding through his chest even after all this time. "I love you, Yannick Lawrence, my husband, my partner, my home. And I love you, Grushka Lawrence, today, tomorrow, and always." Hope made a happy gurgling sound and reached up to pat both their faces, as if sealing their words with her approval. They stood together on the porch as the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. In the valley below, their community thrived, a testament to what was possible when people chose love over fear, hope over hatred. It had begun with blood soaking through a shirt and an orc woman tearing her own dress to bandage a stranger's wound. It had grown into something neither of them could have imagined: a family, a home, a future. And as Yannick held his wife and daughter close, looking out over the life they had built together, he knew with absolute certainty that every trial, every hardship, every moment of fear and doubt had been worth it. They had found their happiness, carved it out of the wilderness with their own hands and hearts. And nothing, not prejudice nor distance nor the weight of history, could ever take that away from them. This was their story, their triumph, and it would endure long after they were gone, carried forward by the children who played in the valley and the community that bloomed around them like flowers in spring. The future was theirs, bright and boundless and full of promise. And it had all started with a single act of kindness, a moment of compassion that had defied every expectation and changed two lives forever. From that first meeting, wounded and desperate, they had built a love that transcended every boundary. And now that love was spreading, touching others, creating ripples that would extend far beyond this valley. As the stars came out one by one overhead, Yannick made a silent promise to the universe and to the family he held in his arms. He would protect this. He would nurture it. He would spend every day of his remaining life ensuring that the peace they had found here would grow and flourish, that the children who came after would never know the fear and hatred that had driven him and Grushka to flee civilization. "Come inside," Grushka said softly, interrupting his thoughts. "Hope needs to sleep and you need rest too. Tomorrow will bring its own labors. In a moment." He turned to face her fully, memorizing the way the starlight caught in her dark hair, the way her eyes glowed golden in the dimness. "I just want to remember this, how perfect this moment is." "It is perfect," she agreed. "But there will be many more perfect moments, husband, a lifetime of them. We have time." And she was right, he realized. They had time. Time to watch their children grow. Time to build their community into something even stronger. Time to simply be together, to love each other through all the seasons that lay ahead. The desperate flight was over. The struggle was behind them. Now there was only the future, bright and welcoming, stretching out before them like the valley itself. They went inside together, and Grushka settled Hope into her small bed while Yannick checked the fire and secured the door. It was a simple domestic routine, one they had performed countless times, but it never failed to fill him with contentment. This was home. This was family. This was everything he had never known he wanted until he had found it. As they lay down together in their own bed, Grushka's hand found his in the darkness. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what? For choosing me, for staying, for building this life with me." "I should be thanking you. You saved my life, remember? Everything I have, everything I am, I owe to you." "Then we are even. We saved each other." He pulled her close and they lay together in the peaceful darkness, listening to Hope's soft breathing from across the room and feeling the promise of the future growing between them. Outside, the valley slept under a blanket of stars, and in all the cabins scattered across its floor, others slept too, safe and content in the community they had built together. Years would pass, and the valley would grow. More people would come seeking refuge, seeking the promise of a place where old hatreds held no power. There would be weddings and births, celebrations and sorrows, all the joys and pains that make up a life fully lived. Yannick and Grushka would watch their children grow strong and brave, would see Hope become a leader in the community and their son follow in his footsteps. They would grow old together, their bodies bearing the marks of hard work and harder times, but their love never diminishing. And when, decades later, they finally passed from this world within days of each other, as devoted couples often do, they would leave behind a legacy that extended far beyond their own lives. The valley they had founded would thrive for generations, a beacon of hope in a world too often divided by fear and prejudice. Their story would be told and retold, growing into legend, the tale of a human man and an orc woman who had defied everything to be together, who had built paradise from nothing but love and determination. But all of that was still to come. For now, on this perfect summer night, they were simply two people who had found each other against impossible odds and refused to let anything tear them apart. They had fought for their love and won. They had created a home, a family, a future. And as sleep claimed them both, wrapped in each other's arms, they wore the same peaceful expression. The look of two people who had found exactly where they belonged, and who knew, with absolute certainty, that they would never be alone again. Their journey had been long and fraught with peril, but they had arrived at last at the destination that had awaited them all along, each other. Home. Forever.